Salam, everybody. I think we're live now. Just wanted to welcome you all to our latest installment of the Samawada Network. As some of you may have joined us last week, we had a really awesome discussion surrounding the Baltimore uprisings and the situation that was going there, and talking a little bit about the racism that exists within the Afghan community. So this is our second discussion that we wanted to have. We're hoping that people are joining us live on Facebook and talking to us and communicating through the event page. So please, if you have any comments that you want to make, please talk to us through the Facebook event page, and we'll do our best to answer some of the questions and some of the things that come up through the discussion. We ask that you all be respectful and be mindful of the things that you say and what you talk about in the Facebook page. Just a little bit of introduction to myself. My name is Omar Aziz, and I am here from the Bay Area, but I will let everyone get a chance to quickly talk a little bit about where their name and just kind of where you're talking to us from. So I'm going to start with Afifa.
Hey, assalamualaikum everybody. My name is Afifa. I'm from San Diego, California. I'm an academic counselor. I work in the community college setting, and I'm also doing coursework to be an LPCC as a therapist.
Thanks. And we'll go to Ali.
Salam everyone, my name is Ali. I'm coming from Orange County, and I'm a historian and writer.
And Amrita.
Hello everybody, my name is Amrita, and I'm a freelance reporter here locally in the Bay Area and a full-time student.
And we'll go to Farouk John.
Hi everyone, I'm Farouk. I am a couple and family therapist here in the Bay Area, San Jose to be specific.
And Eli.
Hello everyone, my name's Eli. I'm from Fremont and I'm a financial auditor.
And Nora.
Salam everyone, my name is Lura. I live in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm working on my PhD at Duke.
And again, my name is Omar, and I'm here from the Bay Area. Reza is going to join us hopefully soon. He'll be on this call. But I did want to take a moment to introduce someone who is, someone we're really lucky to have here on our discussion, Nangia Alaijan. One of the things that one of the things is that this discussion is going to be based and centered around issues surrounding gender, and in particular, women's a lot of issues that a lot of the women in our community face. And how, as men, we can be allies and support some of the struggles that exist in our community, whether it's within Afghan culture and Western culture. And Nangia Alaijan is somebody who's done a lot of really awesome work in the U.S. and in Afghanistan. So I would love for him to just take a minute to introduce himself and talk a little bit about the work that he does, because I think it's a great inspiration and a great segue and a great model for a lot of us to kind of look after. So, Nangia Alaijan, I'll let you kind of have the mic and just talk a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and tashakur and salam to everyone, and for that introduction. So I'm currently right now in LA. I was here for a summer reception for Their World, which is an organization, non-for-profit, supporting children's education around the world, and it's managed by Sarah Brown, which is the wife of the former Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Gordon Brown. So I was here for that. But I'm based in the Bay Area. I came to the US 2.5 years ago, and I will be going back to Afghanistan in August or September. I'm planning. I'm preparing to go back there and just help back. I work back in Afghanistan and advocate for girls' education. And I think that's very important for the prosperity of the country and the progress. And here is my observation here in the United States, that I see families not standing behind their daughter's education here in the United States. And I think it's a huge, I would say, it's a mistake. It's a mistake in their children, in their children's life in future, and in particular. We need to support, and I think families and brothers here need to support their sisters and their education, and they should stand behind their sisters' education. I think there should be no reason in this country for parents not to support their daughters for better schools or support their educational dreams. I'm coming across a lot of active women here, young girls. They are doing a great job, but I do think parent support here is very critical to this, and I would be happy to answer any specific questions that comes forward, either here or in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Nangyala John. Again, we wanted to make sure, we thought we're really lucky to have someone who can really bring a perspective from Afghanistan and from the U.S. As well, and thought that was a unique opportunity, so we wanted to give him a chance to share. And Reza John, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, you hopped on a couple minutes late, but go ahead and I'll give you the mic right here.
Salam everyone. I'm sorry I hopped on so late. My name is Reza. Currently I work as an instructor at Kaplan, and as it says in my bio, I was a former community organizer. I've done a bunch of other things within the Afghan community and the Muslim community, and I'm really eager to hear what you guys have to say.
Awesome. So first of all, I just wanted to give a little bit of a recap from last week. I did want to start with congratulating the Golden State Warriors on their victory, on their Game 1 victory, because I'm sure right now we're waiting for some viewers to come back to us from watching that game go to overtime. So obviously you can see my jerseys repping the Warriors, but yeah. So last month when we had our conversation, we talked a lot about the Baltimore uprisings. So since then, the police have been indicted, and obviously the attention hasn't been as big, but the police have been indicted. Their charges range from, I believe, second-degree murder to some lesser charges. So that's still kind of an ongoing case, and we encourage everybody to really continue to keep up, the pressure, and continue focusing on that issue and continue looking into those things. One of the things we talked a lot about is that racism in our community still exists to a great extent, and it's important for us not to allow that conversation to end. I'm hoping that people are having those talks within their groups of friends, family, whoever it may be, and are really continuing moving that forward. We talked a lot about systemic and institutional racism that exists and how we're kind of byproducts of that, and I think tonight's discussion will hopefully touch on a little bit on the systemic issues that kind of exist surrounding gender. When we talk about patriarchy and how that is systemic, and how that manifests itself in our lives, in our daily lives, in our interactions. So I'm hoping we can kind of get a good understanding of that tonight. And again, countering the oppression that we discussed last time was we talked a lot about self-work and talking a lot about self-reflection, and I think that's going to be the goal again from tonight, is to really reflect on who we are as a community and what some of our issues are and what some things we need to work on. So little things like we talked about the use of the N-word, that is pretty pervasive in our community and something that for a lot of people they use, but something as small as preventing yourself from doing that is something that we can all an action we can take. So continue these actions, continue these small steps, because they will hopefully play out and work against that racism that exists within our community. So tonight, we're going to talk a lot about gender and a lot about about the issues that kind of come along with that. And I wanted to start a little bit on just having some definitions and some terms for people to kind of understand So I know some people may have seen the original title was, we talked about misogyny and sexism and patriarchy. So I wanted to give a couple people some opportunity to define some of those words. So I think, one of those things, I think maybe patriarchy, like what does that mean? We hear that word thrown out a lot. So if someone wants to, unmute themselves and just kind of take a lead on just defining that for folks and letting them know what we mean by that when we use that term. Somebody has to take a shot at it, or otherwise I'm going to call on people.
I vote Ali John. Or a FIFA.
Hi, man. Go ahead. I think I've always thought of patriarchy as a system. It's systemic, right? So it's a system, a societal system that's designed for men by men. That's kind of how I attribute it. As to how that plays in, maybe we can kind of let other people chime in on that part.
Anyone wanna add to that? Any other folks want to?
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. Yeah, I agree with what Afifa shared, and I wanted to say that it has all these like stereotypes about men and women, that men are inherently dominating and inherently superior, and the list goes on about what males are, and then whatever males are, females aren't. So if men are strong, and then females are weak, and if men are incapable of feeling certain emotions, then you have females that are overly emotional. So I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything more, but
Ali John, go ahead.
I absolutely agree with everything that was said. But what I would add to it is that patriarchy is an economic, social, political, and cultural structure of power that favors men and is often built by men. It's not all-encompassing, and it's constructed, so it has various variables to it, and it manifests in different ways, sometimes in overt ways like economic disparities, sometimes in very subtle ways like cultural representation.
Well, I just did a quick just Google definition thing of it, and so what I got is a system of society or government in which the father or eldest male is the head of the family and descent is traced through the male line. But then underneath it talks about a system where men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it, and I think that kind of is we're going to touch on that a lot in terms of power and who has it. And especially when regards to men and women, we kind of how our society looks and how it's shaped. So anyone else want to add on to that? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to a different thing. Amrita, did you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe the historians and the PhDs can probably answer this a little bit better, and I'm very curious to know. But one of the things that I feel about patriarchy is that it starts at home. When a little girl, a little boy grow up together, let's say, or just a girl or just a little boy, whether it's with parents, especially if there's a father figure or paternal lineage is present in the household, that child grows up to view the world also to a certain degree in that sense. And then that's also what kind of perpetuates a lot of the way the world works as a system, whether it's in government. Because if a little girl grows up and believes very strongly that the world is only a type of patriarchy because that's how it was in her household, when she grows up, it is a lot more likely for her, I'm not speaking of statistics, I'm just speaking of just my personal experience and then also just having observed the world, that she is observing the world from a patriarchic view, from kind of the way it was taught to her, the way it was inbred into her. And it's difficult to change that, especially if there's no other supporting power to change that view. And so maybe things like that start at home, and maybe and I definitely think it starts with boys and young men and our brothers and fathers and uncles and cousins that are male that can help us change that type of that type of behavior, I guess, for lack of better words. Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about gender roles and kind of I think I'm echoing, but a little bit about how it plays out in the home. So can anyone kind of talk about what gender roles are and how that plays out, and maybe how that's played out, and particularly within Afghan cultures and Afghan culture growing up, how that might look for people. So what are some things that we've been taught? And first, what are gender roles, and then maybe some examples you can share, whether from your own experience or from others.
I know that, sorry, I'm jumping in on anybody, but I know that I used to mentor at a masjid in the valley, and we went there with the United African Club at UCLA, and we went there once, and the singular issue on some of the girls' mind who were in junior, senior year of high school would be whether or not they'd be able to move out of the home to attend college. And I think someone mentioned that on the Facebook event page. And that isn't, I mean, that's not all encompassing of what the gender roles are within the Afghan diaspora, but I do think that that is a very prominent issue, whether or not a woman or a female's place is at the home, no matter their level of education. Right? And so it's sort of, there's a dissonance that I sort of felt when I first confronted that issue. Their fathers are okay with them going to get an education and getting a degree, but they were not okay with the idea that they needed to leave home to go get that degree. And I think that that's this sort of interesting, there's an interesting interplay going on between the expectations of being educated, but you still got to be at home to do it. And I think that is a defining gender role, unfortunately, for many young Afghan women.
Anyone else want to speak to Eli? Were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to add, a lot of times people fear the unknown, and most of our parents immigrated here, so they didn't go through, the education system here. They weren't familiar with, going away for college and things like that. So I'm the oldest sibling, and when I was ready to start applying for schools, my mom basically told me, you're limited to Bay Area schools, so don't even bother applying to any SoCal schools or out-of-state schools. So, I got lucky that I got accepted to a good school nearby that I was able to commute to, and my sister went to the same school as well. But once I graduated and I started working, I had to start traveling for work. So I started traveling across the country, even across the globe internationally, and kind of use the Farsi expression like like she got used to it. Because of course she's not going to let me not travel for work. She kind of had no choice but to accept it. So once I started traveling, when she got okay with that, when my sister asked to study abroad for a summer in London, my mom agreed. And that's something that I never would have even thought of asking, because I already knew the answer back then for me would have been no. So I think it's just something that they have to get used to, and maybe, if you have a large family and maybe one of your cousins moves away first, and maybe the younger siblings or younger cousins might have that path paved for them. So I think it's all about, whether it's the oldest sibling or the oldest cousin, just being that first one in the family and kind of just starting to pave the path for everyone around you, and kind of getting the parents and the other generation used to the idea of it.
Yeah, to echo off of what Hilary John said, I haven't lived at home since I graduated high school, and my family's a bit unconventional in the sense that they supported that, right? But what I find interesting is that when we send girls and encourage them to go to attain an education, it's not necessarily for the same reasons we encourage boys to do it, right? So they're like, what's the point of your daughters, attaining graduate degrees? The point is to get a good degree enough to be able to raise their children. So it's interesting how you hear this discourse in the broader community about why women go to school versus why men go to school. And we, to a certain degree, while we may encourage education, it's sort of, I find that there is this line where people still be like, okay, enough education, you're educated enough for a woman. And that kind of conversation I've seen even amongst women who are doctors. And I'm like, you're a doctor, how are you saying this to other girls, right? And that's a tension that I think exists that we need to sort of unpack.
Nangyala John?
Yeah, so I want to say two things. One, back in Afghanistan, I think I grew up in the countryside, so the perception for women, the way it's orally defined by the cultural codes, is to be at home. That is how it's seen. They need to take care of children, or they need to take care of the livestock, it may be cows, something like that. A very traditional kind of perspective of the women's role. And when it comes to education, I think that is that is even not talked about. Even if girls are going to the mosque, the masjid, they will go like when they're until 10 or 12. I think when it comes to 15, 16, they would even not allow them to go to mosque even for religious education. So that is the countryside kind of perspective. And it still exists. It still largely exists, unfortunately, in rural areas. And there are many families when they send their daughters, they would send them until 6th grade, but after that they would not allow them to go more than that. Or when they go to, or they graduate from high school, even in Kabul this happens, they would not allow them more than that to go for a college. So it's but it's now an evolving debate. But and here in the United States, I came across, when I was in Washington D.C., I came across a very educated family. In the husband allowed her daughter to go to study medical school at Columbia University, but the mom was not allowing that, her daughter to go to Columbia University, because the mom was more concerned about her daughter's physical presence as a woman, but was not actually supporting her talent. And we were sitting on a table when I saw this discussion. I came across, and I used some strong language to the mom in that sense, that if your daughter is that much talented, that she has a dream to study medical at Columbia University, and your husband is supporting, but you're not supporting it, this is something like nonsense. I came across using strong language. And she wants to become a doctor, and the girls is like getting top A's and is great in her class. But here is the thing, that when it comes to, and when I would say people who are listening, when your parents are telling like why they're not allowing, if they say that this is in our tradition and this is in our culture, ask your parents, can you give me a book of that culture so that I can read that it's written that way? There is not such a book. There is not a written book about our culture. It's just simply saying, and what we're trying to do is failing our children, and in particular our sisters, just by something that is non-existent in written. It's orally things that just goes and everyone can interpret it differently. So not to go beyond that, but I would say, I would encourage daughters and our fellow sisters to actually ask their parents if there is a written narrative, a written book of an Afghan culture that says that girls do not need to go to Columbia University or something like that.
Go ahead, Ali John.
I think one of the things that Nurajan mentioned is absolutely right on point, that the social effect of patriarchy is that people are defined by their genders, and that overshadows every other aspect of their life. So when a woman or a girl in an Afghan American community goes, I'm going to school, that attempt at getting education is defined first and foremost by her gender. What type of education is she allowed to get? How is that going to intersect with her role as a potential mother or a sister? And so this is something that we need to become aware of how patriarchy intersects with these social expectations and defines us in regards to our gender.
Go ahead, Afifa.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of going back to your question about what are gender norms, that I think it spans, kind of like as Ellie touched on, like it spans so far beyond just educational limitations. It's kind of how it's the thought process that we're taught and raised with, from birth onward, right? How we dress, how we talk, what kind of emotions we can feel. As what John kind of touched on, what emotions can we feel, as a young boy versus a young girl, how are we taught, how are we socialized, what is expected of us? Girls, from my own experience, we're taught to be ajiz, we're taught to be sensitive, we're taught to be responsive, and a lot of that is nature, but I wonder how much of that is also nurture, and a lot of that I think is also what goes hand in hand with gender norms. So for me, it's also very expansive, and also part of why I feel that patriarchy is also very harmful to men. Right, as I said, it's a system designed for men by men, but it can also be very detrimental to them in their own development. And I see that a lot of times in our own community, that men struggle with the burden of patriarchy and the burden that's been established in that. And I'm sure others can speak more to that, but I kind of just wanted to bring that up as we kind of move the conversation forward. That in a lot of ways that we can talk about women's rights and we can talk about those things, but those first have to start also with men, that they're a huge contributing factor to that development and to that process, and also to how it impacts them as a whole as well. That's it.
Risa, go ahead.
So one of the things that I personally observed culturally, especially in our culture, is that a lot of the things goes back to kind of like what Nangela John said, that where is it written? So the response to that is a lot of times families, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles that think that they have the right to dictate over the lives of, like, let's say, their nephews and nieces and things like that. They can say, well, it is written, either it's in the Quran or a part of our culture, that girls are not supposed to do this and women are not supposed to do this and women are not supposed to do that. That also comes in when it comes to domestic violence. It comes to, I guess, female empowerment to a certain degree. Almost all of that, gender norms are very, very much culturally set, but it's by things being said at home, like, it's not a part of our culture. It's been passed down. It's not in the Quran. It's that for you to have that much freedom or that much power or that much brain, let's say. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think anyone really does, just simply because I think, just also religion-wise, things have been passed down where perhaps it's not it's based on interpretation, just like any book, any religion, any cultural anything. So norms are dictated by cultural sayings, to me, I think, and then that's what then goes on further to the girl believing that, the whole world believing that, the boy believing that, who then grow up to be men and women and run the world and run their families. And perhaps the family therapist can kind of speak to this. How does that work? Like, when you have a very strong female, let's say, in a marriage, she comes from a home where she was allowed to do anything and everything. She was allowed to be herself, but then she marries into, let's say, a family where she is not supported in her ideology. She's not supported in all of that she grew up with. There's a conflict in that, and then also vice versa. So I think norms are so heavily dictated, especially in our culture, but perhaps all cultures, by the tone we set from childhood on, by the tone that is set culturally by books, by Quran, religion especially, perhaps religious ignorance, most likely, but nonetheless.
Eli, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just to add on to Afifa John's point about how patriarchy can be detrimental to the men as well. I know in the Bay Area there's kind of a stereotypical saying where, people are always hating on the guys for not being as educated as the girls, and they're always saying, look at all these universities are full of Afghan girls, but where are the Afghan guys? And one of my friends brought up a point during the African American conference a couple months ago that I thought just was really eye-opening. She said that a lot of these times these guys are responsible for becoming the breadwinners of their families. And she kind of pointed out, you know, that's why a lot of times you have these young Afghan men that are spending 3, 4, 5, 6 years at community college because they're also working full time to support their families, and that burden doesn't necessarily fall on the females in an average family. That was a really interesting point that she had brought up, and kind of helps explain some of these stereotypes that we see, you know, where in the past you might just hate on guys for not being educated, but when you really dissect the reason for why that might be the case, there's a lot of hidden things in there.
Yeah, and I think to touch on kind of some of the points that were made in terms of religion, I think that one of the difficulties that we have is trying to challenge a lot of the norms that exist in our community. It seems kind of difficult to have those conversations when kind of religion gets brought into the discussion. So, I mean, I don't know. How do other people handle that? One of the things that I've noticed is, for example, for a lot of guys, I mean, I always feel like they are. There's always a jump to kind of policing what women wear and how they act and what they do, especially when it comes to religion. I can't count how many times I see men posting or, like, you know, talking about what women should wear, or, you know, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So I don't know if other people have had similar views or felt that as well. And I've always found it a little bit odd that, you know, men are so quick to jump on talking about that and policing that. So, Alijan, I think you were gonna say something here.
Yeah, I think you bring up a fantastic point, and I think it's not unique to Islam. It's not unique to any one religion. Religion is a set of values, it's a set of rights, it's a set of a code of conduct, and it's culturally constructed, socially constructed, and there's historicity there. As a result, like any form of ideology, it can become a source of inspiration, or it can be used as a tool of oppression. So when it comes to religion, we have to ask ourselves, are we calling upon our religion as a spiritual source of inspiration that guides our life, or are we wielding it as a weapon in order to feel superior towards others and police others' behavior? If it's the latter, then we've allowed the religion itself to become a weapon, a tool, rather than a source of succor.
Anyone else wanna touch on that at all, or kind of? No, John? Go for it.
I really have to second what Alijan just said. I think that it's a really dangerous slope and then a lot of it, as discussing this, have come from ignorance, that we really have to sort of know. And like, I wear hijab, and for my family, sort of in the spectrum, it was not a decision they supported. I come up from a very sort of, they're from Kabul, and it was not something that reflected well on my family. And it was interesting to me that a decision that I made personally was one that other people thought they had a choice and could give an opinion on. And I find it interesting that when women make decisions about their dress, whether they choose to wear a hijab or any form of dress, it's something that our community feels like they have a right to discuss and be a part of. And it's like every woman should have agency to make a decision for themselves, and it's a reflection of what inspires their life. But for whatever reason, our community sort of, we don't really do that as much with men, but with women, whether you wear something or don't wear something becomes a topic of discussion, and we feel like we have a right to comment upon it and make a judgment upon it. And I find that very dangerous, you know. And I think that as men and women, we really have to push back in terms of giving people the agency to make decisions in terms of what represents them. But women's body and what we wear becomes a constant point of conversation, and it's not just within Muslim communities. Open Facebook, look at like magazine covers. We never comment on what men wear on GQ, but if you look at Vogue or whatever, you see that conversation consistently come up. And I think Jon Stewart made a funny comment about Bruce Jenner, that we know he's a woman now because as soon as he became Caitlyn Jenner, like, they started talking about what he was wearing, right? But that's the reality of the society we live in, and I think we have to acknowledge that.
And just to build off of what Ali John and Nur John were saying, it doesn't necessarily have to come from just ignorance. There are a lot of people who know these sort of salient talking points of Islam, like the hadith, heaven rests beneath a mother's feet, right? And I've spoken about that. I spoke about that at the Afghan American conference, how that's an amazing sentiment to have. You should respect your mother, right? Heaven rests beneath her feet. But it can also be a dangerous sentiment to really believe in and take very literally. Because if you place your mother on that pedestal, denying her of her human agency to make mistakes and to be flawed and to have faults, then that bleeds over into the relationships with other women that you have. I've seen it happen in my own life, and I've seen it happen in other people's lives, where putting someone and creating an illusion about who they are and turning them to something purer than what they're capable of being creates this expectation. And then reality hits, and they're a real person with flaws and mistakes and everything else that comes with it. And shattering that expectation creates, I think, a certain violence within men. And it doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be mental violence where they lash out, where insecurities grow. So this kind of strengthening of patriarchy doesn't necessarily have to come from religious ignorance. It can come from a certain amount of knowledge about the religion, and where you take things too literally, where you take things for granted, and you're not self-aware enough to realize that, hey, you know what, maybe I'm denying this person the agency of being a real human being.
Thank you for that, Reza John. So we were discussing a little bit about the influence of religion, how that kind of plays out in our culture, in terms of what effects that has in kind of perpetuating some of these norms that we see here. And I think we also talked about, it's a worldwide issue, some of these things, like in terms of like beauty and policing like women's bodies and what they look like. And how do you feel like Western culture, like the intersection between Western and Afghan culture plays out, or what is the influence? Like, I guess sometimes I think about, okay, what's more oppressive? Is there one that's more oppressive? Is Afghan culture more oppressive than Western culture? Are they equal? Do they just look different? Like, what are the differences between that? Because I know when we say, some people generally think Afghan culture is so oppressive, but we also have forms of oppression in Western culture. So I don't know if anyone wants to kind of touch on that and what that looks like for women in just Western culture in general.
I think it's very much the same, but just in different forms. I really do think, just having grown up in the East and in the West, it is fascinating how, in certain ways, women are viewed here that is so unbelievably oppressive in comparison to the way, let's even say, Afghan women or Indian women or, let's say, Pakistani women are viewed. Because I'm just taking, right, like 3 extreme cultures where in the media it's shown, and believe me, journalists are #1 at this, are completely shown as putting these cultures as, oh my God, they're so oppressive, they keep their women down, and Saudi Arabian can't drive and all that stuff. Yes, okay, that's all great and horrible, but at the same time, how is it here in the West and in Western culture, like for example the United States and Europe, so many families have the same view as a lot of, let's say, Afghan families might, that their daughters, okay, that's about enough education for a woman, or a woman's place is in home taking care of kids. There are laws in Europe governing still today where it doesn't allow for a woman to, that a woman has to be home by a certain time so she can be the one taking care of the kids. Things like that. I mean, like, there's stuff actually written into laws and policies that govern a woman's life and how she should be in society, maternal instincts to be a part of that. For example, just the whole beauty notion in this country. I mean, it is absurd. the beauty industry, the fashion industry, the makeup industry, all of that, like, and I think that is where both oppressions are very, very similar. They just have perhaps maybe a different name, a different face to it, but it's very much the same. And perhaps someone else can shed a little bit more light on that to even educate, me and the rest of us.
Go ahead, Afifa.
I think when you asked that question about kind of I think you asked how has patriarchy influenced women's roles in American culture? Is that kind of what you asked?
Yeah, just kind of how it plays out in Western culture and not just Afghan.
Well, I mean, I think I spent, I want to say almost 2 years, maybe more than 2 years, as a domestic violence and sexual assault advocate, kind of in my local area, and so in going through kind of a crisis intervention training process and in working with those clients that patriarchy is alive and well, it's here in the U.S., that women are victimized and then we're re-victimized, and just kind of this process, and I'm sure that both Amrita and Farouk can speak more to that as well, if you'd like to, but yeah, I think for me it was almost a point even, in that training process. I remember somebody kind of looked at me and said, well, don't you think that your religion validates this? Don't you think that, your religion, teaches men to abuse women? And I kind of just stopped and went, that, our clients are so diverse, right? We know that this isn't just a singular focus, that domestic violence and sexual assault and abuse of women happens across cultures, across religions, and it goes both ways, but I think in just kind of that conversation, and that too, again, it takes a toll, right, on men as well. So just kind of something to add in.
And I just wanted to share, you asked about oppression of women in the Afghan culture and also in Western culture. So I think in the Western culture, I mean, all women are oppressed regardless of, or just in general, all women are oppressed, but then you have things like, race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and all these other factors that sort of play into it. And, if you're a woman of color, now you have another level of oppression based on, your race and not just your gender. So I also wanted to take that into consideration, and maybe you all have some, ideas that you want to share about that, but that also seems to be another sort of layer of oppression that gets added on. And I don't know how that exactly gets played out within the Afghan community, but I know that in the West that's pretty huge.
Nangyala, John, I think you want to...
Yeah, I just wanted to just to share for information. I don't know how specific this could be to the conversation, but still, but I can say this for sure, that women, I have now lived here for 2.5 years. Compared to here, women in rural Afghanistan are more oppressed. Their lives are controlled. They are entirely controlled, and I think some of them are just enslaved. And I can say this for sure. Women doesn't have property. They don't have their own houses. They don't own crops. They don't own gardens. So, but here in the U.S., at least women here can have their own houses, can have their own property. But in Afghanistan, if you're in rural Afghanistan, I mean, owning a house as a woman, it's not going to happen. And I would say that maybe if barely a woman whose husband has died and that she's owning that house or the land or property, that's it. So it's just the one example, but yeah, wanted to share.
Go ahead, Reza.
I just wanted to thank you for making that point, because oftentimes I see this thread of logic coursing through not just our community, but within the Muslim American community too, where we try to compare the different patriarchies. Patriarchy exists throughout the world, in every culture, in every religion, wherever there is man and woman, patriarchy exists thus far, except for in those small, tiny island societies where it doesn't. But and so comparing our different patriarchies is incredibly difficult, and I think it can lead us down a track where we start saying things like, oh, the West is just as bad as the East, and it's not. It's patriarchal, it's hierarchical, there is domestic violence, it has not gone away, men still beat women for no other reason than they're women, but it still is quantifiably in some ways a better experience for women here in the States than in rural Afghanistan. And I'm really so happy that you made that point, because I don't want us to veer into that kind of logic where we try to compare and equate the two different patriarchies, because that's dangerous, and it's not cognizant of our own privilege living here in the United States. Because at the very least, I, as a man here in the United States, can be aware of how patriarchy influences me. And I'm not so sure that my counterpart in rural Afghanistan would be aware of that, or would be even receptive to that kind of an idea. And so, despite that, the fact that I live in a patriarchy, I am privileged in that I can at least recognize that.
I think I'll let Eli go, and then Nangiala after.
Reza, I completely agree with you. I guess one argument I would make for continuing to talk about the issues in the West is to not idealize the West, not to hold it up as some perfect standard, because there are still issues here as well. One of the things that comes to my mind, since I work in the the corporate finance world, is the salary gap between men and women. I think the statistic is like for every dollar a male makes, the female only makes like 70-something% of that. And I just saw this kind of firsthand with my own eyes a couple weeks ago. I was in a training session for the new class of soon-to-be promoted managers at my job. And every year we have a starting class, that's what we refer to as. 5 years ago, my starting class of people that I started out with as first-year staffs, it was pretty split, 50-50 male-female. There's about 40 of us. 5 years later, as we're about to be promoted to managers, I was looking around the room. There's 15 of us, and there were only 4 girls left, and the rest are all male. So that ratio has gone drastically more male for female at the management level. And just, like looking higher up at the partners at my firm, it's predominantly male. So even in the Western world, in the corporate world, women are still trying to fight that corporate ladder. So it's still something that our generation is facing. I know prior generations have made huge strides, but it's still an ongoing battle.
And Nangiala, John?
Yeah, I want to say that overall, it's to compare, when you come to the comparison, I would say that you cannot compare these two when it comes to women's roles. In particular, when it comes to Afghanistan, I would say, I largely speak, since I grew up in the countryside, I know rural Afghanistan. Even if a woman, a wife, is working and doing handicrafts, so the money that she gets from that handicraft is taken by her husband in many cases. So even women cannot have their own money in a sense. So I think the discussion here in the US is quite in an advanced level. It's a difficult one, also a complex one. But in Afghanistan, we're still talking about basics. I think now to imagine that 50% of your population do not have the right to the cash that they earn by themselves. I think it's something that you make the half of the population completely economically dependent on the rest. So I can talk it that way. So something to mention.
My only concern with comparing, and I think we should be grateful that we have privilege being citizens here, because we live in a country that has not gone through conflict, has not gone through what Afghanistan has gone through and is going through right now, right? My only concern is that when we compare like that, there are people that have this paternalistic view that let's take Western solutions that have worked in the US and implement it to save Afghanistan, versus rather than empowering Afghans to make decisions to sort of, we have to uplift women in Afghanistan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what worked in the US and the solutions that Western women have are what's going to work there. And in idealizing what worked in the US in a certain way, we're sort of justifying those who want to be paternalistic to do that. So that's my only hesitation in sort of idealizing what happens here. And the only anecdote that I'll add is that at Harvard we had a program for women to run for office. The second session of the program, we brought in a beauty pageant consultant. We spent 3 hours talking about women's image and how that was like fundamental for them to run for office. And I found it so heartbreaking that, you know, we're like, oh, women here, it's about qualities, and if you run based on your credentials, it'll work. And it was like, the reality was the second session of this program was just the sort of role, and I know that this is a sort of different challenge than what happens in Afghanistan, but I think we also have to recognize the context of the US versus a context where Afghanistan was a conflict nation and has gone through so much. So the Kabul that my grandmother knows is not the Kabul that exists today, right? And we have to recognize that context when making these comparisons.
Ali John, go ahead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Noda John. I think to a certain extent we have to be careful with these comparisons because they may not be as fruitful as we think they are. They're two completely different contexts. One has a different socioeconomic background, the other one has a different socioeconomic background. There's different cultural factors, there's religious factors, there's a variety of different factors, and so trying to compare who has it worse isn't necessarily productive. What we can do, however, is ask how we as Afghan Americans have inherited the patriarchal system of both cultures. We are Afghans and we are Americans, and our patriarchy that we live out every day is a hybrid of both. On one end, we appeal to American forms of patriarchy, and on the other hand, we try to employ certain traditional Afghan ideas of patriarchy and gender roles. And so interrogating those is where we should be looking at this question, rather than trying to compare the patriarchies that exist in the motherland and in the United States.
All right, Ali John, I need you to interrogate for me.
Can you say a little bit more about that in terms of what you see or what your experience or observations have been? I'm actually really curious to know.
I'm keeping your face up on the screen for this.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. I think, like every other aspect of Afghan American culture, us being a product of our parents' culture as well as the culture that we're raised, we have hybrid ideas about the world. So we inherit certain things both from our parents and from the world we live in. And this comes very clearly in gender roles. For example, the regulating of women's behavior or women's dress. While it is universal to a certain extent, and Americans do it too, we do it in a very different fashion, right? So there's just a hint of Americanness there, but it's always in the guise of Afghan notions of haya and modesty. And this is very different from what happens in Afghanistan and very different from what happens here in the United States. And the only way to address that is to recognize that we're doing it, recognize the source of it, and then challenge it within ourselves and our communities and homes.
Can anybody speak to like examples of kind of how that looks and how that plays out in our world, in our like everyday lives? Kind of what Ali was touching on, just some of the ways that we've kind of inherited those things. People on Facebook, whatever, if y'all want to kind of jump into and just kind of share your ideas and thoughts as well, please do so. Reza? I mean,
it's not something that I said or that I've confronted, but I don't know if the other guys remember from the conference, but you talked to Sarah different than you talked to Sarah. You know, and I think that's, I didn't say that, but I think it's a very, very perfect encapsulation of how these two kinds of patriarchies intertwine and influence the way that we act.
Treating Sarah different from Sarah, that's what I think Reza just said. I think that's a pretty. I mean, I can speak as a from like a male perspective. From what I've observed and from what I've seen, it seems like that's definitely a reality. I think that there are different standards that we hold Afghan women to, as opposed to just non-Afghans. I think for a lot of Afghans, we've probably grown up having some sort of image of what marriage looks like, what a family looks like, and what that partnership, who that partner would be. So I definitely think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, Reza John. And I'll let Elijah go ahead and jump in.
Well, I was looking through the Facebook feed at some of the posts, and I think Dawood Waziri posted something pretty related to this. You know, when we were talking about the discussion about Afghan guys trying to police what women wear, you know, he said some of those same guys are the first ones liking what non-Afghan girls, like what racy pictures they're posting, and I think that just tied in really well with what Reza was saying, you know, where there's that double standard for how an Afghan woman should be treated and viewed versus a non-Afghan woman.
Oh, sorry. All right. Nurajan, I think, were you going to jump in? Oh, no. Okay. So one of the things that I think some of us kind of touched on is just talking about policing women's bodies and just kind of how we treat women. And I think it's important for us to understand like the concept of violence. I think we can all agree that we see domestic violence. We talk about sexual assaults. But in the last discussion we talked about those like smaller everyday occurrences of racism that exist. So I think it would be good for us to talk about what are some of those smaller everyday manifestations of patriarchy, of sexism that kind of exist that maybe we don't always see or don't always recognize. I don't know if anyone, I mean, I have some thoughts, but I mean, I don't know if other folks kind of want to jump in on this and just talk about it. For me, I know that like in terms of, that violence, it plays, like I said, it plays out in different ways. And I think for a lot of Afghan guys, there's like a big like jealousy factor, and there's a big part of like controlling like what women do, or like if they and especially when they're in relationships. And I think we do have to recognize that is in effect a form of oppression and a form of violence towards women. So that's something that I think about. But I don't know if others want to jump in on some of those everyday occurrences that exist. Farouk?
Well, I think the media does a really great job of objectifying women and dehumanizing them. And you see that on TV, you walk around the mall, you're surrounded by, pictures of women that are, objectifying them. And, just magazines, I mean, everything. Our culture does a really great job of doing that. And so when you dehumanize somebody, then it's so much easier to be violent against them. And I think that's where it starts.
I see a comment on Facebook. Marshall asks, do you think we could look at all the ways patriarchy is manifesting itself in our people and say, that is not my culture, and I can go back in history and find a place where women are honored? So can we go back in our culture and find that? Alijan?
No, I don't want to be very careful about this. I think it's a perfect question. It is a really, really good question. But we want to be careful that we don't fetishize or idealize a sort of golden age that existed at one point and then was originally and then somehow got destroyed either through war or through interventions of whatnot. The reality is that societies have been patriarchal for a long time, and it's not a new phenomenon. But I'm looking at the question. She does also bring up the notion of hyper-patriarchy, and I think that is something that's uniquely modern. is that there's new and more subtle ways of patriarchy manifesting now than there existed in the past. So what I would say in answer to that is that we can look to our culture, we can look to our past and find those aspects of it that we wish to cherish and uphold and put our values in that. But we shouldn't look to the past and say, there was a golden age which we can return to, or if we get rid of these kind of interventions, some type of pure culture will emerge. I don't think that's the case. This requires active and ongoing activism on our part, and really investigating what we put our values in. Just to touch on one of the things that was brought up here is the matter of policing bodies. This really speaks to how men on an almost unspoken level view women's bodies, and that is as property. And this is the idea that when you get jealous, when you try to control a woman's body, when you try to regulate it, you're viewing that woman without agency. You're viewing that woman as an object and you as the subject. And that's something that we need to be aware of.
There's another question on Facebook from Saba who asks, so like in what ways can we break down the walls of gender equality and patriarchy, and how can we Afghans get there? So referring back to Nangyala John's comment, how do we get that girl to go to Columbia to pursue her dreams of becoming a doctor? How do we make our community more tolerant? Where like maybe a man takes care of the house for the women is the breadwinner. She's asking a lot of questions in one comment, so I encourage all of you to kind of go to the Facebook event page and read it. And how do we become aware of our privilege? But how do we just kind of fight against a lot of these things, and what can we do to kind of to combat all these things that we talked about earlier? So if we want to kind of move ahead with that, so does anyone want to jump in with that? Kind of how do we change all of this that we talked about, and how do we kind of combat this giant system that we've kind of discussed and dissected a little bit? John?
Yeah, I think just to the earlier point, is there anything in our history, in the culture that we can refer to? I think that one of the example would be, which is hundreds of years ago, is that Buddhist civilization. If you see the Bamyan example, the two Buddha statues that we had, the tallest standing Buddha statues on the planet, one was a male, one was a female, and those are the tallest, were the tallest icons in a sense of the Buddhist civilization that we had in the past. So when we treated men and women equally in that sense, hundreds of years ago, we were a civilization, and we became a civilization at that point. But then we step by step reduced the role of women. Here we are, and we are in more trouble. I think we can look into more of that example of the Buddha statue and how we could have a narrative for the future. It can be a long discussion. It will take a long time. But now to the second point of how we can change this in order for that girl to go to Columbia. I think it's just courage. We need to stand, and if we see that our parents are wrong, we should stand. We should stand against them. And I want to say this for sure. Sometimes we just are not courageous enough to stand against our parents for telling a narrative that is not true, for standing against a narrative that is non-existent and that is non-written. And that is just destroying us, just for the sake of this is Afghan culture. I think we need to be courageous in order to change. Back in the countryside, when I was there teaching girls, I came a lot of examples that there were problems that either parents will not agree to sending their daughters to school. There had been, I cannot specific talk right now on my family, but since I'm going back and it will be there. But I can say that there has been instances in our family where our father would say, okay, no, my sister, they study until 6th grade and that's enough. But there were cases that I, as a brother, had to stand, and our other brothers, that we had to stand and face our father and say, no, we need to change. And we stood in a way that we kind of abandoned our own dad in the countryside, and we needed to move out to the capital in order to give our sister education. So sometimes if we want to break down a culture that we don't believe in, that is not empowering us, what we need is to stand. And that is the way we need to be courageous. We need to have that courage. By that way, we can break down a culture that in many instances it's non-existing, and it is not empowering us, and it is not making us successful and better people. There was earlier a point that it's not that there are things in this society that are maybe not working in that way, that the Afghan society might be better, that the Afghan society in some instances might be more better in a sense. But here I want to say, for women or for men that are saying that United States is not a good place for women, the same women or men, they can go to Afghanistan, they can live for a month or two, and then they will understand how different that society is, how difficult living for a woman is in that society. So when they see that practically, or they go to the countryside, there are fine things that our parents are telling. Those are tales in many cases. Those are just tales that are, or they're telling us, oh, Afghanistan, or maybe something, the golden age, women were free or men are free, things like that, or green gardens and that beautiful Afghanistan. But when you go there, you will find that they were just simply fairy tale telling us that fine Afghanistan. The countryside in areas in Afghanistan is extremely difficult for women to thrive. So I just want to pinpoint that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan. We'll go to Elian, and then we'll move on to Nora.
So as far as the topic of allowing girls to move away for school goes, I think something really beneficial that we did as part of the Afghan Club at UC Berkeley was we held a College for Afghan Day on campus, and we invited prospective high school students to come and hear from panelists of students, and we also included on that panelist one of the parents that had allowed her daughters to live on campus at Berkeley. So she gave a speech about how she was hesitant, how she kind of overcame that, and for the sake of her daughter's education, let them come live on campus. And after her speech, all the prospective parents, they came like flocking to her and just asking her questions about their own concerns. So I think just being able to put the resource together for people to be able to network and to meet each other, and if you don't have an older sibling or older cousin or family that's kind of paved that path, is being able to get connected to that stranger that's gone through that and kind of help share that experience and kind of ease some of the concerns that the parents may have.
And Rajan, go ahead.
This is just real brief. I just have to say, I admit I don't feel like a pioneer when it comes to women's issues, because I was blessed with the privilege of having my grandmother and her sisters in my life. When I would visit Fremont, I would go to Stanford because my great aunt with her Kabul degree was working there as a librarian. She's still there now. And each of my great aunts, until they retired into their 70s, one worked at Fry's and was a manager. You guys may have run into her if you're in Fremont. My grandmother is a teacher. That was a couple, not to idealize the past, but to say that some of us were blessed to have this older generation of women that we saw working. So when I didn't really recognize my challenges as a woman until later, because I did have those examples in my life, and that's just something I want to bring up, because I do think that Afghan culture means something different for everybody here, and we all come from different experiences, and I don't think there is one Afghan culture or one experience, and depending on our family context that is different. And I have to admit, I don't feel like a pioneer a lot, because I was blessed to have these women in my life who still work, somewhere in their 60s, and that was the families they came from, and it made it easier for their great nieces and granddaughters and great granddaughters to sort of continue doing that work. And that is a part of the reality of Afghanistan that was brought here, and I feel like I just wanted to share that too.
Thank you. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts or ideas in terms of what we can do to kind of combat some of the things that we discussed? Anyone want to jump in? Reza John, go ahead.
I think one thing that we can do is not grow less ignorant of our religion, because like I said before, I think that patriarchy can come from people who do know the religion a little bit, but to know Islam better, because Islam and Afghan culture are not inseparable, and I think that if you do try to separate them, you ruin both. And so, in terms of like understanding better what Islam is, it doesn't just involve going to your library and like reading everything, because I don't think that there are a lot of people who have that privilege there where they live close to a library or they're able to go to a library safely, etc. But I do think that probing and asking questions and having a mindset that's more skeptical than not is something that everybody can do. And so if you hear or read something, even if it's from a trusted source that you believe in, I think injecting a sense of skepticism into not just our discourse, but our way of thinking, and inculcating that when we are young. I know that I was privileged enough to have a mother who put into me and into the way that I learned a lot of skepticism and a lot of humility about not just myself, but my religion as well. I didn't hear the whole all paths lead to God from other sources. I heard it from my mother, my religious, devout, 5 times a day praying mother. And so I think that injecting skepticism and humility into the way that we think, and especially directing that skepticism to sources of authority, will allow us to be courageous, because while I do think it's important to be courageous, I think that it can be hard. And I do not think less of people who are fearful. And I think that one way to empower them is to let them know that your source of authority is not all-knowing, it's not omniscient, and it's not all-powerful.
Go ahead, Amrita.
2 things. So one is I feel like so many of our parents and families are so worried and fearful of the others that it holds them back. But yet every family has the same fear. It's interesting. It's like every family wants to do what's right for them, but then they're like, no, someone else, what is society going to say? What are they going to say? What is this person going to say? Therefore, then internally they have this war within themselves, like, okay, should I allow my kids to do this? Should I myself do these things? If I do, they're going to look bad at me. But I feel like almost every family thinks like that. So where does it stop? How do we end that? Do we like have an AAC senior and like seniors or parents, let's say, and sit everyone down together and say, listen, you are all on the same page. Stop being afraid of each other. You don't stop, you don't talk smack about that one, and just do your thing. You do you do your family, and just be. I don't know. Like, I'm seriously at a loss, because I feel like so much we are held back by simply as just that even being one of the biggest issues. So that's just one point. If any of you have a solution, please tell me. The second thing is, I work in or I volunteer for causes of domestic violence and things like that. And one of the biggest things that happens is, especially in this area, in the Bay Area, a lot of the victims are from Fremont. A lot of the victims are Afghan women. Survivors now, hopefully, in most cases. When you ask an American domestic violence caseworker, what do you think? Let's talk about this. Why the Afghan community? Their response is, well, it says it in the Quran that an Afghan, or that they're allowed to beat their wives if they are disobedient. They're allowed to beat their wives if they are, not taking well care of children. Where do we stop that? How do we change that narrative? because the way the world sees Islam, the way the world sees Afghans, Pakistanis, Muslim Indians, is that Islam is this endless religion of violence, especially and oppression, especially towards women. I'm not saying that we need to have this discussion about religion and all that, but I think that that's a really big issue that very, very strongly is a factor in how women are viewed in our culture by ourselves, as us in a culture, and by outsiders, and how oppressive or how oppressed women are in our culture and how held back they are.
So I think, I was looking for some answers and you just presented more questions for everyone else. So thanks for complicating things a little more for us. But no, you really did bring excellent points, and I mean, I want to allow other folks the opportunity to either jump in to kind of address some of the questions that Amrita John was bringing up, or you know, talk more about kind of ways we can kind of move forward and how we can address a lot of these issues that we talked about. One of the things is that we've stayed very big picture throughout this entire conversation. So I mean, I think we're going to be kind of running down in the last probably 5 minutes or so. We'll try to be done by 10:30. But just want to give people the opportunity to share some last thoughts and talk about things. And I'll let Ali John go ahead.
Thanks. I think like any type of ism, like any type of problem, racism, sexism, it starts with first ourselves, right? Recognizing how it manifests in our thinking, how it manifests in our actions, how it can be subtle, like a judgment that we make about a person from the second they walk into a room, how it can manifest more actively, like we treating different genders different ways, and then expands outward into our families and into our communities, holding one another accountable and starting a conversation. I would love to see the narrative change on a lot of things. I would love to see the narrative change about race. I would love to see sexism go away. I would love to see the narrative about Islam be changed. But these are things that will take time. And cultures are not static. And that's the one thing as a historian that I always remind myself, is that no matter how hard it seems, we can recognize one thing, that cultures are not static, that cultures change over time, just as religions change over time, and people's perceptions of cultures and religions change all the time. And in order for us to enact those changes, we have to be that change. We have to ensure that our actions every single day, and it's hard, that's what they don't call it, you know, activism for any other reason. Act is right in the word. You have to do it daily, you have to do it consciously, and it has to be deliberately done. And if we do that, then we can enact a change in our culture. We can enact a change that fights back against patriarchy and oppressive gender roles, and in turn also improve the discourse about Islam, because the patriarchy that exists within Afghan American society and within Muslim society is used as justification in paternalistic, orientalist foreign policy. So I always tell my elders whenever I have a conversation with them, like, look, if you want the U.S. to stop invading, you got to stop treating women badly. Right? Don't give them cause. Show them that Islam is more than that. Right? It's obvious a joke. There's far more complicated things there. But be the change that you want to see. Start off with yourself and work with your family, work with your community, and work at it every single day. And these narratives will change within our lifetime. Slowly, but surely.
Fingers crossed from Reza. Anyone else? And there's also another question. So last couple of minutes, and I think this question is kind of related to the point of how do you challenge these things. And one of the questions that was brought up is like how much, Eli kind of brought this up as well, just how much, you know, other people influence our lives. And a lot of the discussion that we've just had is, you know, living for other people and, you know, following these norms and these things that have cultural norms that have existed in our lives. So other folks, if they want to jump in and just kind of help close the with maybe tips on how to challenge these norms that exist in our community. I'll let Afifa go, and then I'll get to you live.
I think a lot of what we're talking about as far as those standards and family pressures and societal pressures stem from being part of a collectivist culture, right? That that there's pros and cons in that, but to kind of how to navigate that. I see a growing shift as far as kind of how to address these issues. It is, I mean, I feel like we've talked about a huge spectrum of things. We've gone from domestic violence, to all these other topics, gender norms, et cetera, education. But I think for me, from my school of thought, my fieldwork, my experience, that, and actually, how I was raised, my dad was the first one who taught me that, education is what would change my trajectory in life. And so I think that educating women, empowering women, empowers everyone in a sense. Self-sufficiency, that's something that I've also witnessed in our community as well, that when women become self-sufficient, that creates a shift not only in the family but also in the community for their children as well. So I think that's also one of the things that I do. As an academic counselor, that's what I focus on, and one of my passions. So again, just from my perspective as a counselor, that's one of the ways that I feel like I can actively every day do something, in progression towards that.
Go ahead, Eli.
I would say the biggest thing is to just prove them wrong. Show that the women can do whatever they set their minds to. I was pretty young when my dad passed away, and as the oldest sibling, I remember very vividly how so many of our relatives and family friends would come up to both my mom and myself and say how horrible they felt for my mom that her oldest child was a daughter, a female, and not a son, as if it meant that, I somehow couldn't become a shoulder for her to lean on. But I always used that as one of my biggest motivating factors to prove them wrong. I got a part-time job in high school. I went to school. I got a good job. I helped support my mom and help raise my younger siblings. So I feel like it's just something that you have to use to help motivate you. And then once you get there, once you've become successful, you pay it forward. So now when I go to local events, I have people coming up to me, bringing their young daughters to me, kind of telling them my life story or whatever, and saying, come talk to Eli, get some advice from her, come see how you can follow her path. So, become that role model, become that change that you want to see in society. I would say that's kind of the biggest thing we can do as a grassroots type of movement.
And Amrita John, go ahead.
Kind of going off of her points, first of all, kudos to you, Eli John, for all of that and for being that role model. One of the things I do feel that when we women are in trouble, we know how to organize. We do. It may take a while. It may be through the most secretive, going around about way of doing things, but we flip and do it. Men, no offense, what I want from our men in our community is to do what we women do as a support group to each other. I feel like my dad's generation does not have enough support from each other. They do not sit down with each other and speak about the things that they deal with. Identity crisis being one of the biggest ones. They were big men in Afghanistan, maybe not every single one of them. And then they go to, they become immigrants, they become refugees, and with that goes dignity. It's true, no matter how you see it. And so, and I know this was brought up at AAC quite a bit. So things like that, so maybe perhaps this is my solution. What I would think if I was a guy in the Afghan community is I would get all my cousins and brothers and homies and everyone together, get our dads, go for a picnic, go wherever it would naturally go and start these conversations. Padar John, Kaka John, Baba John, let's talk about these things. I'm serious. Let's not walk away. Don't tell me ke chup bash. Don't tell me to be quiet. I know what I'm talking about. I'm old enough now, so I respect you. I ask the same. Let's have these conversations. Why is there domestic violence in our community? Why is one of the biggest, community of victims of domestic violence Afghan women in this country? Why are so many Afghan girls and women illiterate or uneducated in Fremont, in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, or in San Jose, why can that daughter not go to Columbia University even if the dad is saying it? But so, it's just things like that. But that only you guys can do that. We can't infiltrate into that. Believe me, we'd love to, but we can't. We at least not yet. So you guys take that upon yourselves and just do it. Go have these conversations. Start it. Seriously, it'll be uncomfortable. I can totally imagine that. Get uncomfortable. I don't care. We have to get uncomfortable every single day, having these conversations with our parents, having to confront them with, hey, listen, I do have an American boyfriend, or I want to go to college, or I'm going to drive my own car across the country because I want to see the world. Stuff like that. So if we can have those, you guys can have those. I rest my case.
I think Reza was going to talk about how he was going to do all the things you just mentioned, Amrita. Go ahead, Reza. Tell us the grand plan.
The master plan, the diabolical scheme I have. No, Amrita, I wanted to support you and say that the anecdotal evidence that you have bears out in science. Men actually generally don't have the kind of support networks that women have. There's one study that comes to mind that kind of talks about this in a really kind of like funny way, where men took longer in this study to recover from heartbreak than women did. And one of the reasons that the researchers cited was that women have a tighter knit support group that they can turn to in those kinds of times. Yeah, I guess something like this. And so I think that what you brought up is really important, that men do need to have honest, vulnerable conversations with each other, and not just between, horizontally, my generation talking to each other, vertically as well, between the generations. I think it's important because you never want to leave them behind just so you can leap forward. I don't think that's morally correct, and I don't think that's helpful either. So I just want to support you and say that your anecdotal evidence bears out in the science.
Yeah, I also wanted to just add on a little bit too. I think that as Afghan men, I think we do definitely have to step up our role in terms of helping end a lot of the stuff that we're discussing, and just kind of the gender norms and those things. I mean, I think Rona John talked a little bit about just like not favoring sons over daughters, and like like the daughters having certain expectations, and like if we see that play out, as men, it's important for us to call that out, and it's important for us to kind of acknowledge those things that are occurring, and not just wait for women to have to do that all the time. I think men have to have those serious conversations and really step up with one another in terms of making those changes. So I would love to see more of that happening, and I think for us to call each other out and help kind of grow to be allies for women and help this struggle. Angela, John, I'll have you go, and then we'll start wrapping up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, yeah, Hilay exactly said that, prove them wrong. I think we need to prove them wrong. I think that's the best way to do it. That's the courageous way, using the courage. I think that's the way that we need to change the culture that is, in fact, non-existent in some cases. And and we need to support our sisters. And if our sisters are not receiving the support from us, then I think Afghan girls need to prove their brothers wrong in that case. So it all comes to that courage aspect. I personally, I can say I stood with my sisters, and I continue to stand with them. In my generation, my sisters are the first one. My older one is going now to college. She wants to become a doctor, and the other one is 12 and she is in 7th grade. This is happening back in Afghanistan. And if for brothers here not to be able to support their sisters to go to a good university, I can say that fully, shame on that brother. I think we need to support our sisters in this country. We need to support them to the best extent possible that we can. And if we are failing our own sisters in this country, we're just we're just ignoring a prosperous future to ourselves and to our generation, and we're not changing. So I just can say it: prove them wrong. Period.
Thank you, Nagaleja. Ferojan, I think you were gonna say something as well.
Yeah, I think it's great that, we've been talking about, stepping up to the plate and kind of proving people wrong, but I also I don't think that the burden should fall on women to sort of, cure the, wounds of patriarchy. I think it's important for men to acknowledge their unearned privileges that patriarchy grants them, and start embracing parts of themselves that they neglect because of patriarchy. And when you start accepting all parts of you, and you start becoming accepting of other people, of women, of homosexuals, or people who don't fall into these perfect categories. And so I think unless we have men acknowledge those unearned privileges, I don't think we're gonna get anywhere.
John, before, yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick, and then.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to just say something?
I'll go, and I'll let you go. Yeah. If you could put yourself on mute real quick. Okay. All right. I wanted to end. Let me see. I was echoing for a bit. I'm sorry for that, people. But real quick, I just wanted to mention before we let Nurajan close us off. I think for men, it's really important for us to really just be open about like being feminist, and I think that identifying as that, because I think that if you just look at what the word feminism means, it just simply means men and women having equal rights, and just I think that that's a really important thing for us to understand, that that is all that word means. And there's so much baggage around that word, and there's so much negative kind of connotations. Like there's probably people that were like, oh, this is just going to be a talk about feminism or something like that, and then they didn't want to watch or they didn't want to participate. And I think we really have to step away from that and just really embrace that and understand what that word means, and use that to our understanding. And all of us need to really embrace that, men, women, whoever it may be. I mean, I can speak for men, coming from that's my experience, but we just have such a negative connotation to that word, and I think I would hope that we could try to remove that a little bit. So Nurajan, I'm going to let you close us out, and so I'll let you kind of have the floor at this time.
Thanks. I was just going to say we have an esteemed race scholar, and he says that when you discuss systems, so like patriarchy, it's almost like the Matrix, where there's a red pill and the blue pill, and you take the reality pill, and I forgot what color it was. But this sense of consciousness, so patriarchy is sort of so entrenched, and I think it's such a blessing that we're having this conversation, that the first step is consciousness and acceptance that we have these challenges. And it's so entrenched in our daily basis that even people who consider themselves feminists fall into traps where we reinforce things that disadvantage men, and women versus men, and it's the system we're caught up in, and we're part of the system, and it's going to be hard to break from it. But even small conversations before your mother or dad, or like drinking chai with them, the solutions that we were discussing is so powerful. I think just the fact that we're here now having this conversation and building this consciousness is so powerful, and that we can't forget that. And living in the South, but there are no Afghans, I think it's really, I'm excited to be part of this, and I hope we get more folks from across the country and the globe in on this conversation. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of it.
And thank you, everyone, for joining in this conversation, and we'll hope and we'll hopefully have more in the future. So just keep on the lookout. We'll have like mostly through Facebook. So I encourage everybody to just we'll find you, and just make sure you're all looking at those notifications and seeing any messages from us for any future discussions. And please feel free to reach out to me, and if anyone else wants to open that up. But if you all have any suggestions for future ideas, future conversations, future topics, and just things that we can discuss within the community, and so that these discussions can be beneficial for all of us, for the Afghan diaspora. And I would encourage all of you to read the description of what the Samobad network was that Reza posted on the Facebook page, because I think it speaks a lot to what the goal of this this conversation is, and the goal of what we're trying to get out of this. So thank you all for joining, and hope you all have a good night. Go Warriors.